Hi, Slush. It's good to be here. Nice warm fire.
It is. Should we rotate around as we
Yes.
go along?
Karen, I'm really glad that we have a chance to talk here because so far what we've been seeing in Slush is that we can climb up the mountain a little bit and have a brighter view of what's happening, and that's what you're bringing here. So I'm really thrilled that we can discuss a little bit about the cities and a new report that you just published, and the fact that what shocked me is that the population are shifting away, are moving away from big cities. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So if you think about what is a city is a technical solution to a problem that developed in the Industrial Revolution, which is we needed to have lots of bodies clustered to run our factories. It's an ingenious solution, and it's one that's worked in many places. It's part of why when we look at economic development, urbanization tracks closely with that. If you think about what happened in China, for example, you had someone earning about $700 a year US move to the city and make 5 to 7 times that working in a factory because of productivity increases. So that's the old solution. But today, in advanced economies, we're no longer solving that problem. We're not creating businesses. The people here at Slush aren't starting up companies that require lots and lots of people. They need very specific types of people, but they're small companies, and they tend to stay small. Even the unicorns that become large financially don't become large employers. And so having living situations to solve for the problem of a lot of labor doesn't really match with what's driving the economy going forward in service-based economies. And so the challenge is, why do we believe in advanced economies that urbanization will continue in a straight line? And why are we solving for that? Why are we building housing units that consist of stacked trailers, for example, what we've seen in London or in Brooklyn? Does this sound appealing? Anyone, raise your hand if you're jumping to live in a stacked trailer, like the 50th one up. Sound good? Anyone? I don't see a hand raised, right? So this is not appealing. So the question is, what is the solution what is the problem we're trying to solve, and what will the living solution to that be going forward?
And you're already seeing in figures that
Yes.
people are already moving out of the cities.
That's
Can
right.
you tell us a few examples?
Sure. So in the United States, for example, where the US Census has great data, we've seen 2% of the population move away from city centers, so within about 10 kilometers of City Hall, to what we call the exurbs, which is the outer edge of the commuting belt, so where it's almost uncomfortable to commute. In France, that figure is 3%. So wherever there's a lot of land, you see in advanced economies, you're seeing this, people take advantage of being able to, of the cost of distance declining to move out of cities. Now, there are places where that's less possible. The Nordics, possible. The west coast of Europe, well, you leave Amsterdam and you end up in Brussels. So there's less of an opportunity to uncluster.
And you see that trend also in the developing world, because you talk about the Western world, but is it something happening elsewhere?
Right, so it's a really interesting paradigm switch that we're seeing. So what's happened, what's driving this is spatial economics, or the cost of distance. If you think of the cost of distance as the cost of moving goods, information, and people, well, the cost of moving information is nothing. When we were little, you had to buy stamps. Now, maybe once a year, people buy stamps. You don't send things by post. The cost of moving goods, the X is dropping dramatically. And technology innovations are increasing that pace. So we see drones, for example, even autonomous vehicles will eventually, autonomous trucks in particular, drone-backed. We see companies like UPS investing in that technology. Amazon is a logistics company in many respects, so the cost of delivery. And the cost of moving people is going down because we're digitizing some of the functions. For example, medical diagnostics You don't have to be in front of the diagnostician for many respects. So that's going down. So in economics, when the cost of something goes down, all other things being kept equal, people use more of it. And so that is a tipping point. The most important development going forward in advanced economies, and then I'll get to your question about emerging markets, is scale. Because things like accretive manufacturing and automation in retail and services mean that the cost of having a restaurant or having a store go down. And the way most media, most commentators think of this is that means all those jobs go away. But what if it just means we open up more outlets so that in a community of 100,000 people, you could have the same variety of retail and services that you used to need 1 million people to serve. And suddenly living outside of areas becomes more attractive. And that's why we're seeing the accelerating pace. Now, the fundamental development paradigm for the last 50 years has been export-led growth. So that is moving to cities, manufacturing, cheap labor, exporting, finding demand elsewhere. And China was really the last and largest example of this. But if you combine scaling down of manufacturing, again, things like accretive manufacturing, automation, which allow you to make smaller batches at the same price as those large-scale factories, and you think about what that means. For all of you who are entrepreneurs, many of you are serving customers that you understand. Why? Because you can fill a need, understand it, recognize it, identify it better than anyone else, because it's your need. And so your ability to understand, get that customer group is greater. So export-led growth, which depends on cheap labor and scale, becomes a very difficult development paradigm in a descaled world. And so suddenly, what happens? Advanced economies serve themselves, develop products for themselves, and the growth that we've seen in the world, where wealth inequality globally, we saw convergence and catch-up, suddenly stops, and advanced economies begin to pull away again.
So that's even the distance and the stack between poor and rich countries will be even larger.
That's right. So you could see that convergence stop. So it's been a great globally, but it hasn't been great for advanced economies. The irony is what we've seen globally is we've had too much supply and too little demand. We call it demand-constrained growth, if you like to speak geeky economics. All that means is there are more people competing to find the warm beating hearts to consume their products than there are warm beating hearts out there. And that is, in a world like that, labor gets less and less share. And we've seen that in advanced economies, where cheap labor has taken some share, but wages have gone down, inequality's grown in advanced economies. And in the absence of policy change, that's what happens going forward. And so what's interesting about this cost of distance is if you can see people moving out of cities where the cost of living is tremendously high into what we call the new village, where you have, as I said, the variety of retail, these communities being built from the ground up that have walkable high streets, affordable cost of living, localized jobs, suddenly the middle class does better, not because their wages go up, but because their cost of living drops dramatically. They're serving local need, and that helps arrest some of the income inequality we're seeing, but throws that back out to what would have been emerging economies who lose that path forward.
And you already see example of those new community built from the ground up. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure, we were joking. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the TV show The Walking Dead, but that's actually filmed in a new village. It was a developer-built community. It looks like an old-time community, but in fact, it has the elements that we all crave. Why do people live in cities? Because they like variety. They like to interact with other people. So we're not saying that people will leave cities and live with a cow out in a cave, right? This sounds as unappealing as living in a trailer. maybe a trailer with a cow. Anyway, you don't want, and neither of these look very attractive. The new village is what most of us crave, which is the quality of life interactions, the cafes, the restaurants, but with just fewer people needed to generate that. Which isn't to say that cities don't stay important. Cities are increasingly the province of the young because they don't mind living piled in a flat, the rich and empty nesters. And location becomes more important. Cities compete on universities, on having the quality of work, the tech sector. Why has San Francisco and Silicon Valley flourished? Because you need certain knowledge workers. Finance in London and in New York, there are clusters of innovation that will remain, but people who work in them command high salaries and can afford that. What we're saying is people who right now commute long distances, crowd into unpleasant peripheral suburbs, can live places that are worth living in and are more pleasant while still accessing some of those features that are so pleasant.
So you think that movement will increase?
We think
How
so.
far? How big?
Well, what we saw in the 50s and 60s in the United States is 8% of the population in each decade left cities for the suburbs. That's a huge number of people. That would be 25 million people today. And what's very interesting, we were speaking about this backstage, is that social change happens very quickly. Technological change tends to sort of bumble along and then suddenly have geometric growth, but and it happens much more slowly than people anticipate. If you look at the chatter around things like automated vehicles, which I mentioned, you'd get the sense that next year cars are going to be driving itself. Now, anyone who works in that industry will tell you the regulatory hurdles alone, forget the artificial intelligence that it doesn't know, do I kill the baby or grandmother dilemmas that we have sort of abound, it's a ways off. Forget replacement cycles and so forth. But social change is very, very quick. And we don't need Brexit, President-elect Trump, Fillon in France, to show us that these movements happen quite quickly. And so a movement away from cities, it could happen much more quickly than we think. And we expect to see those populations. So as entrepreneurs, I would challenge you to say, where are my customers going to be? Do I believe they're going to be in a pile of trailers? Or should I be investing behind thinking about these new villages that are smaller scale but are sort of self-contained?
And here, especially, we talk about huge companies, worldwide companies. Do you think it will be harder if those small, diverse communities built from the ground up are going to raise to develop a huge worldwide company?
Right. It really depends. What we're seeing is the barbell effect, where some companies provide scale and make it possible for entrepreneurs to exist. Amazon for logistics. It used to be having less than a truckload was a barrier to entry in many goods businesses. Now you can rent delivery. You can rent Salesforce management from salesforce.com. You can rent your artificial intelligence, your server from the cloud. So all of the pipes that you needed to own to start a business come from these huge scale players that are fundamentally utilities. And your marketing from Facebook, right? I mean, there's many ways to do this. And the companies can succeed at a smaller and smaller scale, delighting different niches of customers. Warby Parker in eyeglasses is an example of that. Or many of consumer goods, foods that fill certain niches. They're able to find customer groups and rent the logistics that before they had to own and kept them out of the market.
And so, to your knowledge, the future key player will still be tech-driven even more.
Oh, absolutely. No, technology enables all of these. The confluence of things like drone delivery. Drone delivery is a great example. Do we really think we're going to see drone delivery in London? Can you imagine hundreds of drones in a cloud going through central London? No. But if you're out far from the city, you could actually see that technology implemented much more quickly. And so, of course, technology decreases the barriers to communication, allows us to the digitization allows us to move information rather than people. All of those innovations come together, and enable this. But personally, it's a personal bias. I don't think we've lost our fundamental desire to connect. And in fact, I think the living arrangements that we've created in many advanced economies where people live in fundamentally separated units, get in transportation, either cars or trains, go to the city center and come back out to separation, actually leaves us lonelier than what we could see in the future. And the fact that wealthy people opt out of that and more live in walkable high streets tells me that they just have the ability to express that desire versus people who are middle class and struggling have to put up with either tiny spaces or isolation.
You just mentioned also Donald Trump and Fillon in France. There's many more leaders all across Europe on the same train. How can they influence that development in a good way or bad way, of course?
Well, I think they have to recognize that they're an expression of frustration. Right? That they're a cry for help that, for using the United States as an example, 50% of US households live off their income or subsidies. The households. That another 30% are what we call classic middle class that really had the stuffing beaten out of them in the financial crisis and are only now recovering based on employment going up. And so recognizing that this income inequality, thinking about how do you create transfers in society? Well, some of those are, you can think, maybe classic wealth transfers. Those have historically not been effective, but what has been effective is things like education, good quality health care. There are ways of improving the quality of life of more people through government interventions. And I would challenge them to think about what the problem was what were they called upon to solve as a problem, rather than decide they have a mandate based on whatever rhetoric they were saying on TV. That may not be the answer.
Okay, and how do you see do you see a difference between the US, Europe, China, Africa? We mentioned it also backstage, but there seems to be a big shift nowadays that can affect developments of entrepreneurship.
Right. So I really do worry about the fate of emerging markets. Again, it's really been since World War II, that paradigm has been exporting, finding growth elsewhere. We had a period in sub-Saharan Africa of import substitution, which did not work well. It's very hard to grow and develop a market domestically when you don't have domestic consumers. And so what happens when that development channel gets cut off? I think we could see increasing split of fortunes. Now for Europe, which has suffered under sort of slow economic growth really since the financial crisis, but 2011, here is suddenly a tremendous opportunity, putting aside the fate of the euro and all of the volatility that will come as these international arrangements get restructured, which I believe they have to be. You still have either the wealthiest or second wealthiest group of people in the world, depending who you put in it. What incredible opportunity to service them locally and really delight and understand them. So the opportunity that gets cut off from emerging markets lands squarely back here. And you can see walking around this conference how innovative people are in finding and serving that.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Okay. So what would you be your bet? Who would you bet on as a country entrepreneur?
Right. So from technology perspective, anything that solves that last kilometer delivery problem, be it the transformation, even virtual objects to have in the home or moving goods there, local food creation, anything that creates that variety in a smaller and smaller scale that helps crack that scale problem becomes really attractive in terms of growth. I bet I'm bullish on advanced economies. I really am. And it's a strange situation to be in, having looked back at where the growth has come from. But the combination of the innovation that happens and the wealth and the local population to buy goods and experiment with is unmatchable. And the trust architecture around things like financing, the fact that you can get capital markets funding where there's transparency, that all of that adds to the ability to create the growth capital that's really needed to finance this change.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much. We're done here, so thank you.
Great.
And we're looking forward to see the next future if you're right. All right, thank you.